The first deaths came before dawn. No warning, no omen, just screams behind locked shutters and the stench of sweat thick in the air. London awoke to horror that no one could name. Men who had danced the night before were dead by morning, their beds drenched, their hearts stopped mid-beat. The priests said it was punishment. The physicians said it was heat. But everyone else whispered one word: doom. By midday, the sickness had a rhythm: chill, fever, sweat, death, and it moved faster than any prayer. Courtiers collapsed in the royal halls. Servants fled through corridors slick with panic. Even the king himself barricaded his chambers, convinced the air was cursed. This was no ordinary plague. It was invisible, merciless, and English. A terror that rose like steam from the heart of the Tudor court. This was the summer when England itself seemed to sweat a sickness born of its own pulse, a fever that rose with the crown. It began without thunder, without storm, just a silence that pressed itself against the skin. The air over London thickened like syrup, hanging low above the river, where barges barely stirred. Even the gulls went quiet. In the lanes near Cheapside, people stopped mid-conversation to glance upward, as though something unseen had slipped between the clouds. Horses grew restless, and candles burned shorter, their flames bending inward as if starved of air. It was early summer of 1485, and though no one yet knew it, England was about to sweat itself to death. By noon, the heat had turned wrong, no warmth of sunlight, but a feverish kind of glow that made the cobblestones shimmer. Women covered their faces with cloths soaked in vinegar. Men loosened their collars, muttering that the weather felt haunted. Inside the taverns, mugs of ale went untouched. Outside, dogs whimpered and pressed themselves against doorways. The air itself seemed alive, breathing slow, heavy breaths through every alley, filling every lung with dread. The first to fall was a tailor from Fleet Street. Witnesses said he staggered from his shop, his shirt soaked through, his eyes unfocused. He muttered a prayer, or maybe a name no one could tell, and collapsed face first into the gutter. By the time they carried him inside, his skin was hot as a forge. He gasped once, twice, and was gone. The physician who arrived, an old man with trembling hands and a pouch of useless herbs, could only stare. No rash, he whispered. No marks, the body simply boiled. Word spread faster than the sickness. They called it the sweating, for lack of any better name. Within a single night, it was no longer one man, but dozens, then hundreds. The sound of coughing filled the taverns where laughter had lived the week before. Merchants shuttered their stalls, priests fled the sickbeds they were meant to bless, and the city that never slept began to hold its breath. At dusk, mist rolled from the Thames, thick and yellow as bile. The smell was wrong sweet, metallic, and faintly burnt, as though the river itself had turned fevered. From the palace at Westminster to the poorest tavern in Southwark, servants whispered that the heat carried judgment. Some said it came from France, a foreign curse upon a new king. Others swore it rose from the earth, drawn by the blood spilled at Bosworth only months before. Henry Tudor, the newly crowned king, was said to have ordered all windows sealed in his chambers. He trusted no physician, no priest. He watched the sky darken and wondered if the crown itself was cursed. By midnight, the bells began to toll, not for ceremony, but for warning. From tower to tower they answered one another, slow and hollow, rolling over the rooftops like distant thunder. Londoners huddled by candlelight, waiting for dawn that did not bring coolness. The air hung heavy still, unmoved, unbearable, and in that suffocating calm, England began to tremble. It was not yet the sound of death they heard, that night only the breath before it. It struck without sound. One moment a man was speaking, the next his voice broke, his hands trembled, and sweat poured from his brow as if he'd been running for miles. No cough preceded it, no chill to warn the body of the storm gathering inside, just a sudden heat, violent, suffocating, merciless. They said it came upon its victims as an arrow from the shadows. By the second week of June, Londoners had begun to fear their own breath. The markets of Cornhill fell silent. Bread baked slower in the ovens, and the smell of yeast mingled with the scent of panic. Those who walked the streets did so quickly, holding handkerchiefs to their mouths, whispering that the air itself had turned traitor. Priests carried their crosses beneath their robes, afraid that faith might not be enough to keep the fever from their skin. In the house of a goldsmith near Street Paul's, a dinner was interrupted by the sound of collapse. A guest, a nobleman, healthy and young, clutched his chest, his face crimson, his hair plastered to his forehead. He begged for air. Within minutes, his clothes were soaked through, his breath rattled like stones in a jar. And then he went still. The others fled, overturning wine and candlelight, leaving the body to steam in the dimness. By morning, 3 more from the same table were dead. Physicians gathered in the churchyards, muttering theories into their sleeves. Some blamed the mists from the Thames, others the sins of the people, or perhaps a poison loosed by the new king's enemies. They bled the sick with knives, fed them vinegar and rosemary, burned sage until the air grew unbreathable. Nothing helped. Those who survived the night often awoke weak and hollow, staring at their own trembling hands as if surprised to still be alive. The city's rhythm unraveled. Court messengers were forbidden to travel without escort. Inns refused strangers. The king's council debated whether to flee to the countryside, yet no one knew where the fever stopped. It seemed to follow those who ran. In Oxford, the students who mocked it on Monday were buried by Thursday. In Cambridge, scholars sealed their halls with wax and still found death inside. At night, the sound of prayers rose like wind from every window. Mothers whispered psalms into the hair of their children. Fathers stood watch with buckets of water by their doors, as though they could douse a sickness made of air. The fever had no shape, no scent, no mercy. It came and went as it pleased, taking whoever it touched. By midsummer, the streets of London glistened with candle wax, sweat, and tears. The people had stopped asking why and begun asking when. Somewhere in the haze of that heat, the plague had found its rhythm swift, unseen, unstoppable, and the city learned to listen for the sound of a body hitting the floor. The city ripened under the sun like something left too long to spoil. By the 3rd week, the heat no longer felt natural. It carried a weight, a taste, a pulse. The Thames moved sluggishly through its banks, thick and brown, reflecting a sky that had turned the color of tarnished brass. The air itself seemed to rust. London smelled of iron and sweat, of sickness steeping in stone. People spoke of the scent before they spoke of the deaths. It came first through the narrow lanes of Southwark, then across the bridge, rolling like invisible smoke. It was metallic, acrid, heavy enough to sting the throat. Housewives left their washing half done, covering their mouths with damp cloths. Bakers refused to light their ovens, claiming the smell made the dough sour. At night, the odor deepened. It settled over the city like a damp shroud. Some said it came from the river. Others whispered that it came from the earth itself, breathing out decay. In Westminster, courtiers fanned themselves with perfumed cloths, pretending the sickness was only rumor. But when a young squire collapsed in the great hall mid-supper, his forehead shining and his skin slick, the pretense began to crack. Servants dragged him away while the musicians kept playing, their fingers shaking on the strings. By morning, the court had emptied, the powerful fled north to Windsor, leaving behind only echoes and abandoned goblets that still smelled of wine and fear. London followed suit. Merchants closed their shutters, taverns emptied, and churches filled until the air inside turned hotter than the streets. The priests who stayed whispered of divine punishment. The rich blamed the poor, and the poor cursed the wind. Each morning, the bell of street brides tolled for the dead until no one could tell where one ring ended and the next began. A carpenter named Thomas wrote in his ledger that the sky burned like old copper and that even the dogs refused to bark. He tried to keep working, but sweat blurred. His eyes and the smell of iron followed him home. His wife soaked sheets in vinegar and hung them over the windows. It didn't help. Within days, both their children took ill, their faces red as embers, their bodies trembling until they were still. The neighbors burned the bedding in the street. The smoke rose high and bitter, but the smell, the iron, the sweat remained. When rain finally came, it did not cool the city. The drops hissed against the stones, heavy and warm, as if the heavens themselves were fevered. The gutters ran red with rust and filth. People stepped around them like blood. Somewhere beyond the city walls, thunder grumbled and then passed without rain. The sky refused to clear. Those still alive moved slower now, afraid to breathe too deep, afraid to touch the air. London was rotting in its own heat, and the smell of iron was the only warning left before death knocked again. They said it began on a Tuesday, the kind of day that felt too still, too ordinary to carry death. The sun rose pale behind a haze, turning the rooftops to dull gold. Children chased one another through Cheapside, vendors shouted over the clatter of carts, and the world went on as though the air hadn't changed. But by dusk, one of those vendors, a barrel-chested man who sold eels by the river, was dead. His name was John Imer. He'd worked the same spot by the Thames for 20 years, rain or shine. That morning, his wife found him leaning over his stall, eyes glassy, sweat pouring down his face in rivulets. He said he felt a strange fire in the bones. Within an hour, he was too weak to stand. By evening, the fire had burned him hollow. No sores, no lesions, just heat, trembling, and the wet smell of death. They carried him home on a sheet that steamed beneath his weight. At first, people thought it was sunstroke. The heat had been unrelenting, and men fainted often in those weeks. But then came the second, the third, the fourth. A scribe collapsed at his desk, ink pooling around his lifeless hand. A maid fell mid-prayer in the chapel at Street Dunstan's. A guard at the palace gate was found drenched and gasping, clutching his pike as though to fight the air itself. By the end of the week, Londoners had begun to recognize the pattern. It came like a whisper, an ache in the neck, a heaviness in the chest, a sudden wave of heat that left the heart hammering. Then the sweat began, unstoppable, streaming from every pore. The victims would strip themselves bare in desperation, crying out for cool water that did nothing to save them. Most were dead within hours. The physicians called it the new sickness. They met in shadowed rooms to discuss humours and vapours, scribbling notes that made less sense the longer they looked. Some swore it was spread by breath. Others claimed it travelled through sight. They burned herbs, doused homes with vinegar, and carried balls of camphor in their sleeves. None of it mattered. The fever did not care for learning. Soon, the death carts returned those same creaking wheels that once carried plague victims a generation before. The sound of them in the streets made stomachs turn. Yet this time, there was no visible corruption, no rotting flesh or weeping boils. The bodies looked peaceful, almost asleep save for the wetness of their hair and the terrible stillness of their chests. Neighbors stopped knocking. Families sealed themselves inside, praying the sickness would pass them by. In the night, windows glowed faintly behind drawn curtains, candles flickering beside cooling corpses. Outside, the river moved slow and silent, carrying the scent of sweat toward the sea. The city did not know it yet, but John Imer was only the first name in a list that would soon fill entire ledgers written by men who would not live long enough to finish them. In the halls of Westminster, the air hung heavy with the perfume of fear. Servants moved in silence, their footsteps softened by rushes soaked in lavender and vinegar. The newly crowned Henry Tudor sat in the dimness of his private chamber, the crown still strange upon his head, and listened to the city die. Outside, the bells tolled without pattern or mercy, each one a reminder that his kingdom, barely born, was already bleeding. He had seen war, he had watched men die on muddy fields beneath banners of gold and red. But this was different. There were no armies, no swords, no warning. Men who had feasted at his table on Sunday were dead by Tuesday. The air smelled of sweat and candle smoke, and each cough that echoed through the corridors turned heads sharply, eyes wide, breaths held. The physicians came in droves, offering theories wrapped in flattery. One swore it was a heat of the humours, Another blamed the king's own victory at Bosworth, saying the blood of the slain had cursed the soil. Henry listened, nodded, and dismissed them all. He trusted no one now. Even his closest attendants were ordered to stand at distance, to speak through doors. Fresh rushes were laid daily, vinegar poured across thresholds, tapestries burned at the faintest hint of sickness. By decree, no visitor was allowed to approach within 10 paces of the royal apartments. Those who served food did so trembling, holding trays at arm's length before scurrying away. Letters from the city went unopened, their wax seals dark with grime. The king's guards, masked and sleeved, burned them unread. In the kitchens, servants whispered that the king slept in his clothes, refusing to undress for fear that the fever might strike while he slept. He drank little, ate less, and prayed often, though even the priests hesitated to enter his chambers. One night, when a messenger collapsed in the courtyard before he could deliver his report, the king ordered every gate barred and every commune door locked. No one left. No one entered. Westminster became a tomb that still breathed. Outside, the city begged for guidance. But the king's silence spoke louder than decrees. With the court sealed away, hope shrank with every passing day. Panic spread through the taverns and churches. Men packed their belongings and fled toward the countryside, dragging the sickness with them like invisible fire. Henry sat alone beneath the painted ceiling, the candlelight trembling across his face. The sounds of the court had faded, no laughter, no clatter of cups, no distant music, only the faint scratching of quills in some forgotten room and the slow, uneven beating of his own heart. They would call him cautious, even cold, in the chronicles that followed. But the truth was simpler, darker. He was afraid, not of rebellion, nor of armies, but of the unseen breath that crept through keyholes and killed kings as easily as beggars. In the silence of his sealed chamber, Henry Tudor understood the first rule of his reign. England would not be conquered by men, but by air. It began with a murmur in the corridors, a chamberlain fallen, a lady-in-waiting carried out pale and soaked through. Within days, the royal court became a place of whispers and quickened footsteps, a theatre of silk and terror. Courtiers who once fought for proximity to the throne now fought for distance from one another. The air that had once carried perfume and politics was heavy with the smell of vinegar and fever. They said the sweat reached the palace through the servants' doors. The laundresses were the first to vanish, their beds left unmade, their basins half filled with steaming cloth. A groom in the stables collapsed before the horses, his skin slick, his breath too shallow to finish a prayer. The Queen's ladies fled in pairs, clutching handkerchiefs over their mouths. They burned herbs in bowls of silver, prayed to St. Roch, and wept quietly as they packed their jewels. The royal physicians swore the sickness could be outwitted. They ordered barrels of rosemary water placed in every corridor, carpets doused in vinegar, and braziers burning sage until the air shimmered. But still the fever came silent, swift, merciless. It struck the young and the old alike, sparing neither crown nor commoner. Those who remained at court became ghosts long before they died. Meals were taken in silence, hands gloved even at the table. The king dined alone, his food served cold to avoid the vapors of heat. Musicians played behind closed screens so their breath would not mingle with the air. The sound of their lutes, muffled and distant, trembled like a memory of joy. Each morning, a list of names was delivered to the door of the privy chamber, men and women who had failed to wake. The lists grew longer, ink blotted where the quills had shaken. Henry read them without expression, though his hand lingered each time he reached the names of his counselors. Power meant little now. The fever ignored hierarchy. It crowned its victims with sweat. By night, the palace echoed with the restless creak of doors and the faint sobs of servants. Candles burned low in the galleries, their light bending through curtains hung to divide the living from the dying. Somewhere deep within the royal apartments, a priest muttered final rites over a body that had been royal blood by morning and carrion by dusk. A rumor spread that the sickness could sense fear, that those who wept invited it closer. so the courtiers learned to smile, brittle and empty, behind their masks. They danced in silence, their faces powdered to hide the sheen of sweat, their laughter echoing thinly off the gilded walls. The court of England had become a masquerade of the doomed. Outside, the city burned candles for the dead. Inside, the king waited for dawns that never felt clean. The palace dripped with silence, the marble floors slick beneath fevered feet. In the heart of Tudor power, beneath tapestries of conquest and glory, England's finest men and women were learning what no crown could protect them from. The sweat came for all. They came in pairs, cloaked and pale, their hands gloved in waxed linen that cracked at the knuckles. The surgeons of London moved through the city like ghosts, guided by candlelight and desperation. Each flame they carried trembled against the weight of the heat, bending low, spilling wax across the floors of dying houses. The smell was everywhere now: vinegar, sweat, and something darker, metallic, sweet, like blood turned to steam. Their work began at dawn, when the first bells announced another night of death. Behind shuttered windows, families whispered prayers as the surgeons knocked, their silhouettes sliding across the walls like shadows made of smoke. They brought knives, leeches, and basins of cool water. They believed themselves to be saving lives, most only prolonged suffering. They bled the sick until the sheets ran pink, believing the fever could be drained like wine from a cask. They wrapped limbs in cold rags, fanned the dying with fans dipped in rosewater. Some whispered charms, old words from before the church forbade such things. Others simply stared, wide-eyed, at the way life could vanish in minutes. Sweat poured from every pore of their patients, soaking the beds, the floors, even the walls. In the end, the rooms looked washed in grief. At St. Thomas's Hospital, one surgeon named Walter Green kept a journal. He wrote that the sickness struck as sudden as lightning and thrice as cruel. In his entries, the ink blurred from the damp. He described men who prayed mid-breath, women who gasped for air, children who smiled deliriously before they fell still. It is, he wrote, as though God himself has turned the body inside out through sweat. His final note, scrawled across a page warped by moisture, read only, "The candle has gone out." The physicians began to fall as quickly as those they treated. Their hands, once steady, trembled with fever. The candles they carried became both light and curse. Their flames marked the houses where death had already entered. As they walked through the lanes, people leaned from windows, throwing coins or blessings, but few dared open their doors. To touch a surgeon was to invite the grave. By midsummer, the hospitals were little more than morgues. The dead were stacked in corners, their faces wiped clean of sweat but not of fear. The surgeons burned herbs in clay pots to mask the smell, though it only deepened, thick and sickly sweet. Those who survived a day of tending to the sick would stumble home to vomit, shiver, and pray not to wake, drenched by dawn. In the end, the city learned to fear the sight of a candle in daylight. It meant another house had been claimed. The surgeons walked slower now, not from exhaustion but from dread. They had seen the truth up close. No blade, no tincture, no prayer could bargain with the sweat. And when their own fevers began, they did not call for help. They lit their own candles and waited for the wax to burn down. There was no warning, no wound to show where it entered. Death came softly with the English sweat, silent, scentless, invisible. The body gave no sign until it began to drown itself from within. In taverns, in churches, in beds of silk and straw alike, men would stop mid-laughter, mid-prayer, mid-breath, and feel it an instant of terror, a pulse that missed its rhythm, and then the flood began. They called it the clean death. No boils, no blackened skin like the pestilence of their grandfathers. The victims of the sweat looked almost peaceful once it was done with them, as though they had simply tired of breathing. It was this quietness that terrified people most. One could not see it coming. There was no contagion one could flee from, no face of sickness to memorize, only heat, sweat, and silence. In one London parish, the sexton stopped tolling the bells altogether. He said the ringing only angered the air. Across the river in Southwark, the Sisters of St. Mary's washed the bodies of the dead until their own hands blistered and cracked. They sang as they worked, though their voices faltered each day. By the end of the week, every singer was gone, their beds still damp where they had lain. A scholar named Edward Brinley wrote that the sweat was a sickness of the heart, not of the flesh. He meant it literally. The fever struck fast, but it was the heart that failed, beating itself to ruin beneath the heat. Physicians opened the dead to study them and found no plague in the lungs, no rot in the bowels, only hearts swollen, as if burned from within. They began to call it the inward fire. Rumors thickened with the air. Some said the devil had entered through the pores of the skin. Others believed the souls of the unburied soldiers from Bosworth were seeking warmth among the living. Midwives burned rue and wormwood in their doorways. Tavern keepers buried barrels of ale rather than open them to customers. The city's wells, once crowded with laughter and gossip, stood abandoned. At night, London became a place of whispers. Curtains stayed drawn, candles burned to stubs. The narrow lanes smelled of sweat and smoke, of vinegar and mourning. People began to mark their doors with chalk crosses, not to warn others away, but to confess to heaven that they were ready. And still, there were no signs, no sores, no stains of sin for the priests to name. The death had no mark. It passed like a warm wind through wood and flesh, leaving nothing but stillness in its wake. Those who buried the bodies said the earth steamed when they opened it, as if it too had caught the fever. The ground grew soft and sour, the worms sluggish and pale. It seemed that even death itself was sweating now, struggling under the same invisible weight as the living. And over all of it, unseen, unstoppable, the air waited, heavy and watching, for the next breath to claim. The bells had always been the heartbeat of London, steady, certain, and proud. They rang for weddings and for war, for coronations and for Christ. But that summer, their sound changed. The tone turned low, hollow, drawn out, as if the metal itself had caught the fever. Westminster's bells no longer sang. They groaned. Each morning, their tolls rose over the river, rolling through the haze that hung above the city. The sound travelled like a tide of grief, muffled in the heat, warped by the air. People no longer asked who the bells were for. They were for everyone. The living listened, with their hands pressed to their chests, wondering if their own hearts would last until the next peal. The monks at Westminster Abbey rang them with trembling arms, sleeves soaked dark with sweat. They prayed between the tolls, whispering psalms through cracked lips. Their abbot, a man named Father Oswin, insisted that as long as the bells spoke, God had not abandoned England. So they rang, day after day, their ropes slick with oil and fevered hands. The brothers buried the dead until their fingers bled, then returned to the towers to ring again. By midsummer, there were not enough monks left to lift the ropes. The youngest novices, their faces pale and frightened, took the places of the fallen. The bells faltered, their rhythm uneven, the pauses between them lengthening. On one terrible morning, only a single tone sounded, a lonely, dying echo that faded before the city could answer. In the streets below, Londoners stopped and listened. The silence that followed felt heavier than the sound. Women wept openly. Men removed their caps and crossed themselves, as though that fading toll had carried away the last of their hope. Inside the abbey, the air was thick with the scent of melted wax and smoke. The bodies of the dead monks were wrapped in linen and stacked against the cold stone walls, each one marked with a cross drawn in ash. The remaining brothers sang the Dies Irae until their voices cracked. Some fainted mid-hymn, their bodies slumping against the pews, their skin gleaming as though varnished in oil. By the time evening fell, Westminster was as quiet as a grave. The bells hung motionless in the towers, their great mouths dark and still. Bats fluttered between them in the dusk, and no hand dared to pull the ropes again. From the royal palace, Henry Tudor listened to the silence drifting across the city and ordered his guards to light torches along the walls. He claimed the light would hold back the pestilence, but everyone knew it was fear that drove him. The next day, a warm wind swept over the river. The scent of decay and salt reached the court before the dawn. The city was now voiceless. The bells that once proclaimed the birth of kings and the triumphs of armies had fallen silent, not because they were broken, but because there were no hands left to make them speak. And in that silence, London learned what true fear sounded like. By August, the city seemed to hold its breath. The once bustling streets of London, the veins through which its life had always flowed, grew still. No merchants shouted their prices. No laughter spilled from tavern doors. The carts that rumbled daily through Cheapside now stood abandoned, their wheels crusted in dust and dried sweat. Even the birds, those relentless scavengers of the gutters, were gone. It was as though the whole city had forgotten how to move, how to live, how to breathe. Those who dared to step outside did so in silence, their footsteps careful, reverent, afraid to stir the air. They walked with cloths pressed over their mouths, eyes darting from shadow to shadow. The plague carts came at dusk, now no longer drawn by horses, but pushed by men too weak to speak. They rang small bells instead of shouting, and the sound of those bells cut through the quiet, like the wheeze of a dying breath. The air itself had turned traitor. It hung low between the buildings, thick with heat and the faint sweetness of rot. Windows stayed shut, curtains were nailed down, doors were barred from within. Every household was its own world, sealed off from the rest of humanity, waiting to see which day would bring the first sign of sweat, the first tremor of the heart. In Fleet Street, a printer named Robert Vale tried to keep his press running. He thought that if he could print news of the sickness, he might somehow master it, trap it between ink and paper. But by the third sheet, the ink had thinned with his sweat. His apprentice found him slumped over the press before dawn, the letters of his final sentence smeared into a black blur. The page still read, "The city is holding its breath." Elsewhere, the Thames drifted past like a sluggish artery, carrying its secrets toward the sea. Fishermen refused to cast their nets. They said the water stank of death. The docks emptied, ships moored and creaking softly as if sighing in the heat. The bridges stood empty too, no lovers, no beggars, no crossing of any kind. Just the faint hiss of wind through the stone arches, a reminder that even air could turn against its makers. The few who still ventured out moved like shadows, priests carrying oil for the last rites, gravediggers with faces wrapped in linen, mothers searching for bread no one would bake. They passed each other without a word. The silence was sacred, and breaking it felt dangerous. One evening, a gust of wind rose suddenly from the west, sweeping through the deserted streets and lifting the dust from the stones. For a brief, fleeting moment, London breathed again. Candles flickered in windows, shutters rattled, and 1,000 unseen hearts quickened with hope. But just as quickly, the wind died. The air sank once more into its suffocating stillness. That night, the stars shone cold and clear above the rooftops, beautiful, distant, untouched. Beneath them, the city slept fitfully, wrapped in its own breathless silence, while the fever waited patiently for dawn. They had been the city's last comfort, the priests who carried oil and absolution through plague and fire. But in the summer of the sweat, even they began to falter. The sickness spared no robe, no collar, no cross. Men of faith who had stood fearless through the pestilence of their fathers now trembled at the thought of touching a dying hand. In London's parishes, confessionals stood empty. The people whispered that even heaven had shut its doors. Father Edmund of Street Brides was among the first to break. For weeks, he had moved through the parish barefoot, robes damp with vinegar, muttering prayers as he sprinkled holy water over the doorways. He believed the sweat was the work of spirits that clung to the air, but on a Tuesday morning he was called to a house on Fleet Lane, a mother and her 2 children burning with fever. He entered with his cross raised high. Within hours, all 3 were dead, and by nightfall, so was he. The parish sealed his body in his own church, too afraid to move it. Word spread quickly. One by one, the priests began to vanish from the streets. Some locked themselves inside their churches, praying behind barred doors. Others fled to the countryside, claiming they would bring prayer to the fields, though everyone knew it was fear that drove them. The bells that once called the faithful to Mass rang no more. Their ropes hung limp, their towers silent. Without confession, the people grew restless. The dying begged for priests who would not come. Families whispered the Pater Noster themselves, unsure if heaven would hear them without the right words. Children were baptized in basins of rainwater, their mothers trembling as they spoke the rites. Men made wills by candlelight, sealing them with wax that melted faster than their ink could dry. A few holy men remained. Father Nicholas of Street Sepulchres refused to flee. "If the Lord wishes me to burn," he said, "then I will burn among my flock." He went door to door with a pressed censer, swinging smoke through rooms heavy with fever. The people kissed his hands even as they trembled. 3 days later, the censer was found on the ground beside him, its coals still glowing faintly. By the end of that week, London was a city without shepherds. The churches stood unlocked but empty, their candles unlit, their altars cold. The air inside was damp and sour, filled with the faint echo of psalms that had not yet faded. Those who lived near the cathedrals swore they could hear whispers at night, soft Latin murmurs rising from behind the doors, as if the priests who had died there were still reciting prayers for the living. The people stopped knocking. They left flowers at the thresholds, dried and colorless in the heat. Faith itself had caught the fever, and in a city that could no longer confess, sin and salvation began to look the same. By September, the borders of England were no longer marked by sea or stone, but by fear. The roads that had once carried merchants, soldiers, and messengers now lay empty, overgrown with dust and silence. From the cliffs of Dover to the forests of York, the kingdom had folded in upon itself, sealing its lungs against the world. The plague was no longer London's curse, it was England's, and every man, from peasant to prince, became both prisoner and warden. Royal decrees spread slower than the sickness. The king's heralds rode through the countryside in masks soaked with vinegar, unrolling parchment at a distance, shouting orders into fields where no one answered. Markets were forbidden, taverns shuttered. No man was to travel without writ or witness. But the ink of law meant little when the air itself was death's accomplice. Villages built barricades of timber and prayer. Strangers were turned away at crossroad inns with pitchforks and stones. In the north, the people of York sealed their gates and lit bonfires at night, believing the smoke would drive the fever away. The guards burned herbs by the barrels, and the streets glowed red through the dark. But still, the sickness slipped through. It moved unseen, like fog, curling beneath doors, seeping through the cracks in windows. One morning, the watchman found the fires still burning, but no one left to tend them. To the west, in the green shires of Wiltshire and Devon, families fled into the woods. They built makeshift camps between the trees, hanging linens soaked in wine from the branches as barriers against the wind. Some claimed it worked. The fever passed over them as they prayed beneath the open sky. Others vanished altogether, their tents left standing, food untouched. In Oxford, scholars debated through closed shutters whether the disease could cross water or shadow. Their arguments ended when the Chancellor himself fell dead at his desk. The university sealed its gates and abandoned its halls, parchment fluttering through the cloisters like fallen leaves. The sound of quills scratching, once constant, was replaced by the rasp of shovels digging shallow graves in the courtyards. Even the monasteries, once sanctuaries of calm, became hives of panic. Monks scrubbed their floors with vinegar and honey, their chants growing hoarse from the smoke of their own rituals. They barred travelers at the doors, including fellow brothers. Letters were burned unread, gifts left to rot outside the gates. The sound of bells, once a comfort, became unbearable. For the first time in memory, England felt small. The kingdom that had conquered wars and seas was trapped within itself, a great body gasping for air. The wind carried whispers between hamlets of cities emptied, of rivers thick with death. of the king hiding behind sealed walls. When the harvest came, there were no hands left to gather it. Fields bowed heavy beneath the weight of grain that would never be threshed. The crows returned first, circling above a land that no longer stirred. England was alive, but it no longer moved. It was a kingdom under quarantine, a nation that had learned, too late, how it felt to hold its own breath. They were the last men anyone saw after the curtains were drawn. The carters, those who carried the dead, moved through London's empty lanes like wraiths behind their wheels. Their carts creaked beneath the weight of bodies wrapped in linen, stacked without name or prayer. To most, they were invisible, their work unspeakable. But in those months of the sweat, they became the rhythm of the city's morning, slow, steady, unending. At dawn, the carters began their rounds. They wore masks of cloth soaked in vinegar, though they knew it offered no protection. The air was thicker near the river, where the smell of rot met the sweetness of damp hay. They knocked softly on doors 3 times, then waited. Often no one answered. Sometimes a trembling hand passed coins through a crack in the wood, too frightened to speak. In return, the carters took what the family could not keep their dead. John Mercer was one of them, a man who had once hauled timber for the king's masons. Now he hauled silence. He spoke little, except to his horses. Their hooves echoed down Cheapside, past shuttered shops and abandoned stalls. The flies followed the cart in clouds. John tried not to look at the bundles he carried. He knew some of them by name, neighbors, friends, a boy who had once helped him shoe the horses. The rules were simple. No one touched the bodies bare-handed, no one stopped to pray. The churchyards had long since filled, so the dead were taken to the outskirts, fields turned to pits, trenches deep enough to swallow the city's grief. Monks sprinkled lime to mask the smell, but the earth still steamed as if the fever burned beneath it. Some nights, when the work was done, the carters drank together by the river. They sat apart from the living, their faces hollowed by exhaustion. They joked in whispers, the kind of humor that kept the darkness from swallowing them whole. But always, one of them failed to return the next morning. The fever did not care for courage. John's turn came in late September. He felt it first as a tremor in his hands while lifting a bundle. By evening, sweat poured down his neck, and his vision blurred. He tried to keep working, but his breath came too fast, too loud. When his horse stopped before the church gate, he slumped forward, head resting on his arm. The others found him like that at sunrise, still sitting upright, as though he had only paused to rest. They buried him in the same pit he had helped fill, his cart left standing by the road. The horses were loose to wander. For days afterward, people said they saw that empty cart rolling through the fog at dusk, the reins trailing, the wheels turning on their own. The carters were not mourned. They had become part of the machinery of death itself, nameless, necessary, forgotten. And when they too were gone, the streets lost their last sound. The only thing that moved then was the wind, tugging softly at the wheels left behind. The sickness lingered in what it touched. No one understood it, but everyone felt it, the dread that clung to fabric, to bedsheets and shirts and veils that shimmered faintly with the memory of sweat. It was said that the fever slept in linen, that once the body cooled, it crept from the folds of cloth and waited for the next pulse of warmth. No one dared to wash the dead's bedding anymore. They burned it instead, and still the smell remained. The laundresses of London were the first to vanish. They worked by the river, their hands raw from lye and water. They scrubbed until their palms bled, believing purity could be forced from cloth. But no amount of washing could scour the heat away. One by one, they fell beside their tubs, their basins turning crimson, as their bodies convulsed in the same rhythm they had once wrung their linens. The river took their rags and carried them downstream, ghost-white banners drifting toward the sea. Inside the houses, beds became altars of dread. Mothers changed sheets until their arms ached, only to see the fever bloom again before dawn. The air in the bedchambers grew damp and close, heavy with the scent of lavender and vinegar. The living lay sleepless beside the dying, afraid to touch but unable to turn away. Sometimes, in the quiet between the tolling of bells, One could hear the faint sound of fabric shifting, as though the sickness itself was stirring beneath the covers. Merchants tried to sell new cloth, claiming it came from untainted looms, but few believed them. Entire bolts of fabric were left rotting in the markets, damp with dew, avoided as though they were serpents. The tailors of Cornhill stitched no garments that summer. Their needles rusted in their hands. And yet, the sickness found its way into the cleanest folds. A widow named Anne Ferrers, who had buried 2 sons, wrote in her ledger that she slept only on straw now, throwing away her sheets each morning. "The fever," she wrote, "loves comfort more than sin." By the end of the month, her house was bare, the floor covered only with rushes and sorrow. Still, the fever came. Even the priests began to burn their vestments after each mass. The great stone laundries behind Westminster ran night and day, their furnaces glowing like hellmouths. But as smoke poured from their chimneys, so did the scent of sickness. It rose into the clouds like an offering. And so the people came to fear softness itself. Linen, silk, velvet, all became suspect. The nobles slept on bare boards, the poor on earth. The night no longer offered rest but risk. The city that once wrapped itself in fabric and finery now shivered in rags, stripped of comfort and trust. They said the fever slept in linen, but in truth it had learned a crueler trick. It slept in the memory of warmth, the trace of a heartbeat, the echo of a body once alive. And in every bed where someone died, the air itself began to dream. The sickness, like rumor, found its truest home in the corridors of power. The royal palaces, once hives of laughter, intrigue, and perfume, had grown quiet as tombs. The courtiers still whispered, but not of alliances or marriage contracts. Their voices now carried only dread. Every cough echoed like a prophecy. Every servant's disappearance became another story to fear. They said the sweat moved faster in rooms with silk drapes, as though it preferred the company of the rich. In Greenwich, a lady of the court collapsed while fastening her gown, her jewels scattering across the floor like tiny pieces of ice. In Richmond, 2 royal pages died within the same hour, their bodies left untouched until the king's physicians arrived, sweating and terrified beneath their masks. The palaces began to feel less like homes and more like labyrinths of breath and silence. Messengers carried news between the royal houses, but no longer by hand. Letters were passed on long poles, dipped in vinegar before being read aloud at a distance. Orders were written in trembling ink, servants to be dismissed, feasts postponed, hunting parties cancelled. The king's council met in the gardens, standing apart, their shadows stretching long across the grass. No man dared to lean close enough to hear another's whisper. Within the queen's chambers, superstition bloomed. Her ladies hung sprigs of rosemary in every corner, burned juniper at the door, and tied ribbons soaked in wine around their wrists. They spoke softly of omens, the way the candles burned blue, the way the hounds would not enter the hall, the dreams of sweating angels hovering over the river. One young maid claimed she saw a pale figure wandering the corridor at night, its hands dripping water. By morning, she was dead. The courtiers tried to flee, each one desperate to be first. Carriages rolled through the palace gates before dawn, bound for country estates they hoped were beyond the sickness's reach. But even the countryside was no refuge. The fever travelled with them, carried in fabrics, in breath, in silence. Those who ran died on the road, found days later slumped in their seats, their faces peaceful as if asleep. In the king's private study, the windows were sealed with wax. The smell of ink and candle soot clung to the air. Henry read report after report in solitude, names, numbers, entire households extinguished. Once, when a clerk approached to deliver a letter too near, the king flinched as though struck. "Leave it," he said. His voice was steady, but his hands trembled as he reached for his wine. By night, only the sound of parchment turning broke the silence. Outside, the river glimmered faintly beneath the moon, carrying whispers from palace to palace, servants' tales, nobles' confessions, the slow unravelling of a court that no longer trusted its own breath. The king was said to murmur to himself then, half prayer, half curse. Even the air wears a crown now. And in that thought lay the truth: England's rulers no longer governed by decree, but by fear of the invisible sovereign that ruled over all. When prayer failed and medicine faltered, the desperate turned to alchemy. London's back streets glowed at night with strange colors: green fire, violet smoke, and the shimmer of mercury catching torchlight. The alchemists had come out of hiding, summoned by nobles who would once have mocked them. In a city drowning in sweat and silence, they alone still whispered of hope. They promised cures in bottles that smoked and hissed. They spoke of purifying the air, of transforming sickness into steam, of turning corruption to gold. Their words spread faster than the fever itself. Couriers were sent to fetch their powders from the apothecaries of Bruges and Lubeck, though many never returned. Those who did carried small vials wrapped in velvet, sealed with wax, as though containing miracles. One such man was Master Corvinus, a scholar with blackened fingertips and eyes the color of old brass. He worked from a rented chamber near Smithfield, where the air always smelled of metal and wine. He claimed that the sweat was not a punishment of God, but a rebellion of the body's inner vapors. To restore harmony, he said, one must balance the humors with fire. Burn away the fear, he told his patrons, and you burn away the fever. They believed him. Gold poured into his hands, coins warm from trembling palms. He set up furnaces in every corner of the city, ordering his apprentices to stoke them day and night. The heat grew unbearable. From the rooftops, one could see plumes of copper-colored smoke curling above London, like a new kind of weather. People began to say that the city itself was being smelted, its sins rising in sparks, but the experiments brought no salvation. The alchemists burned herbs, blood, and oil until the air turned poisonous. Their glass retorts burst from the heat, spraying shards and fumes. The apprentices coughed, sweated, and died at their tables. Master Corvinus continued to work, his hands trembling, his robes singed black. He swore he was close to perfection, that one final mixture would transmute death into life. On the morning of his last attempt, witnesses said the sky above Smithfield turned strange, a pale, shifting gold that seemed to breathe. Those who ventured near heard a roar, then silence. When the smoke cleared, the house was gone. Only molten glass clung to the cobbles, shining like frozen tears. The nobles who had funded his work buried their disappointment in secrecy. "The city is too fragile for false hope," one of them wrote. The furnaces were extinguished, and the alchemists vanished again into shadow. Yet people swore that, weeks later, the air in Smithfield still shimmered at dusk, faintly metallic, as if the failed miracle still hovered there, unfinished. In the end, Corvinus had been right about one thing. The fever was not just a sickness of flesh, but of faith, an imbalance between what men feared and what they hoped, and no flame, however bright, could burn that away. By autumn, the Thames no longer smelled of salt and riverweed, it smelled of sickness. The water moved sluggishly through the city, carrying its burden of filth, sweat, and secrets. Moonlight turned it silver, but only from a distance. Up close, the river looked alive, shifting with things best left unseen. Those who lived near its banks said the tide itself had caught the fever. The bargemen were the first to notice. At night, when the current slowed and the air grew thick, the water seemed to breathe, rising and falling, with a sound like lungs gasping. The men refused to ferry the dead across any more, though the pay was good. "The river takes what it's owed," they muttered, tying their boats to the pilings and walking home through the fog. Bodies had begun to appear, caught against the piers, not rotting, not swollen, just still. Their faces were pale, their hair slicked to their temples with sweat, as though they had only just fallen asleep. The carters of the dead no longer came for them. The tide became their undertaker. Fishermen who cast their nets at dawn sometimes pulled up hands instead of herring. After that, no one fished. The Thames had always been London's pulse. It fed the city, moved its goods, mirrored its fortunes. But now it seemed to reflect something darker, an England that had forgotten how to live. The water carried stories from parish to parish, whispered by the wind that skimmed its surface. People said that if you stood at the bridge after midnight, you could hear the voices of the dead carried beneath the arches, soft as prayer. In Westminster, the King's guards lit torches along the riverbank, hoping the glow might purify the water. The flames danced on the surface, but they couldn't hide what floated below. Courtiers avoided the windows that faced the Thames. The sight of the river at night, its slow, silvery motion, its faint stench of fever, unnerved even the bravest of them. A physician named Thomas Eliot wrote that the river sweats as the people do. He kept samples of its water in jars, watching how quickly it clouded and soured. "The sickness is not of man alone," he wrote in his notes, "but of the very earth." He drowned himself 3 days later. When winter crept closer, the nights grew colder, and the fog thickened until it blurred the world to nothing. The river became invisible, heard only by its murmuring, yet its presence was everywhere. The houses nearest the bank glistened with moisture, their walls slick to the touch. People began to hang charms above their doors, small mirrors, sprigs of rosemary, bits of polished glass to ward off the reflection of death. The Thames, beneath the moon, was no longer London's heart, but its shadow. It moved without sound, without hurry, as though it no longer answered to tide or wind. And sometimes, in the deepest hours before dawn, those who could not sleep swore they heard it, whispering a soft, wet voice repeating the same terrible truth. The river remembers. She was known for her scent before she was known for her silence. The Queen, once radiant amid the chatter of court, now drifted like a ghost through corridors clouded with perfume. Her attendants burned amber, musk, and clove in braziers to mask the stench that haunted every chamber. The air around her shimmered with fragrance so thick it stung the eyes. It was said that one could smell her presence before seeing her, a sweetness that clung to the air, defiant against decay. The physicians had told her that strong perfume would guard her against the sweat. "The sickness fears the fragrant," they said. So she lived in a haze of scent, bathing in rosewater each dawn, sleeping on sheets dusted with powdered iris. Yet she did not sleep easily. The palace groaned with whispers at night, the shuffle of servants, the muffled sobs of courtiers dying behind locked doors. Every morning she awoke to new absences, her ladies fewer, their laughter thinner. The king seldom visited her chambers now. He sent gifts instead, rings, velvet, foreign silk tokens of affection, meant to keep her quiet and apart. Once, she pressed one of his letters to her nose, inhaling the scent of ink and wax. "It smells of fear," she told her maid. The words were barely a whisper, but they carried the weight of truth. She had seen too much to be deceived by ceremony. The servants who dressed her no longer met her eyes. They trembled when they brushed her hair, for hair, too, held scent, and scent, they believed, held breath. The fever travelled where warmth lingered, and the Queen was warmth incarnate. To serve her was to stand close to danger, yet she refused to hide behind sealed doors. Each morning, she walked through the corridors with a spray of herbs in her hand, her perfume trailing behind like a blessing or a curse. Rumor said that the smell of her chambers spread beyond the palace, seeping through the cracks of the stone, drifting down the hill toward the city. Some claimed it sweetened the wind. Others said it was the smell of death in disguise, beauty masking rot. Merchants began selling the Queen's fragrance in tiny bottles, mixtures of rose and civet, promising protection. Women dabbed it on their wrists, their throats, their bedsheets. But wherever the scent spread, the fever followed. When her favorite lady-in-waiting collapsed beside the mirror table, the Queen did not call for help. She only knelt, her perfume clouding the air between them, and waited until the girl's trembling stopped. "There is no saving us," she murmured, lifting her own vial of scent to her lips as though it were a chalice, only disguising it. That night, the palace glowed faintly, the air thick with perfume that drifted through open windows and across the sleeping city. London awoke to find the wind heavy with sweetness, and for the first time, even the dying smelled divine. The Queen's fragrance had conquered the stench of death, but not death itself. Far from London's fevered breath, on a low rise above the Kentish marshes, stood the Abbey of Street Alfeg, a quiet place, once known for its singing. The monks there had lived simple, steady lives, their days measured by bells, their nights by prayer. But as the summer of the sweat crept beyond the city walls, silence found them too. At first, the brothers heard of the sickness only through rumor. A cartman passing by the abbey gate spoke of rivers of corpses in London, of priests who feared confession, of the king who locked himself away. The monks listened, nodded, and prayed. They believed themselves safe behind their stone walls and distant fields. Yet fear arrived before the fever did. They began to change their habits, not out of faith, but of caution. The abbey's doors were barred. Travellers were turned away from the guest house. Even pilgrims were refused, their offerings left to rot in the grass outside. The brothers ate apart, each at his own table. They shared no bread, no cup, no embrace. And though the bells still tolled for matins, their sound carried no comfort, only the reminder of isolation. Brother Anselm, the apothecary, burned rosemary and vinegar in the cloisters each morning. He spoke of purifying the air, though the smoke made the younger novices cough until tears streaked their cheeks. The abbot allowed it, for it gave them purpose. Action is a form of prayer, he said. But when Anselm began to sweat through his robes and falter at the altar steps, no one dared approach him. He died that night, with a candle still burning by his hand. After that, the silence deepened. The monks ceased to sing their psalms aloud. Instead, they mouthed the words in unison, the sound of their lips moving like the rustle of dry leaves. They feared the very act of breath. The abbot insisted they keep their rituals, though fewer returned from each procession. The refectory emptied. The dormitory grew still. One evening, a storm rolled in from the channel. The wind howled through the cloisters, shaking the great doors until the hinges groaned. The abbot gathered the survivors in the chapel, the candle flames trembling on their faces. "If this is God's fire," he said, "then we shall burn together." They knelt, whispering the final prayer. Outside, lightning split the sky, and for an instant, the abbey's windows glowed like eyes staring into heaven. By morning, no voices rose from within the walls. The storm had passed, leaving behind only the echo of dripping water and the faint scent of burned herbs. Travellers who later crossed the marshes found the gates open, the fields untended, the chapel door swinging in the wind. Inside, the brothers lay as though asleep, their hands folded neatly, their faces pale but peaceful. No one buried them. The abbey stood abandoned, its silence preserved, and on certain nights, when fog rose from the marsh, villagers swore they could hear faint chanting, carried on the wind, voices thin as smoke, still praying for a world that had forgotten them. By the turn of the season, London had lost itself. Maps no longer mattered. Landmarks vanished beneath fog and fear. Streets that once rang with the cries of vendors and the clatter of wheels had dissolved into a labyrinth of shuttered windows and unlit doors. The city no longer spoke, no longer moved. It had become a shape without a name, a hollow echo of what it had been. The scribes stopped recording deaths. The clerks stopped counting coin. The sound of commerce, that eternal heartbeat of London, had gone still. Even the rats, those tireless inheritors of every human ruin, seemed to have fled. The markets of Cornhill were overgrown with weeds sprouting from the cracks in the stones. The wharves lay empty, their ropes creaking like old bones in the tide. Those who remained no longer called the city London. They called it the hollow place, the sweatlands, the pit. People whispered that the name itself had died of exhaustion, its syllables too heavy to carry. Children born in that summer grew without ever hearing the word. To them, this place was simply here, and here was enough. In Cheapside, a baker named Elias kept a diary. He wrote in broken Latin, half prayer, half confession. "I do not know where I am," one line read. "The streets turn upon themselves. I walk until I reach the same door that I left." He described a silence so deep that he could hear his own pulse like a drum in his ears. On the final page, the ink ended mid-sentence. When the house was found weeks later, the loaves on his shelf were petrified, the quills dry as straw. The city's soundscape became one of echoes and ghosts, distant footsteps that might have been wind, the occasional groan of a beam warping in the heat, the flutter of parchment blowing across the cobbles. The Thames, swollen and slow, murmured to itself in a language no one dared to translate. At night, the fog rolled in thick as wool, swallowing the streets whole. Lanterns glowed dimly behind the mist, disembodied, orbs drifting like lost souls. Those who wandered after sunset often vanished, their names later scratched onto church doors by trembling hands. The survivors learned to live by smell and instinct, the scent of vinegar marking safety, the reek of sweat marking doom. In the absence of priests, people built small shrines in their homes, bowls of water, sprigs of rosemary, bits of broken mirror to frighten away unseen things. They prayed not for life, but for memory to be remembered by someone, somewhere, after the fever burned itself out. When winter's first frost finally came, it settled over the city like a benediction. The air cleared, the bells rang again, but faintly, as if unsure of the sound. The fog lifted to reveal what was left, a city of bones and ashes, beautiful in its stillness. No one cheered. No one dared to say the city's name aloud. It felt wrong in the mouth, foreign and heavy. The word London belonged to the living, and the living were too few to speak it. Winter had barely ended before the sickness stirred again. The cold had given the city a fragile peace, bodies buried beneath frost, air clear enough to breathe without trembling. But when the first buds broke through the blackened soil, so too did the fever. It returned not as memory, but as something alive, patient, and changed. The people who had survived the first wave recognized its footsteps in the air long before it reached them. The wind grew heavy, the river began to sweat again, and the sun returned with a glare too bright to trust. The city held its breath as spring turned gold and cruel. The markets opened hesitantly, voices small and cracked from disuse. Taverns filled once more with laughter that sounded hollow, rehearsed. Everyone knew the silence would come again, they just didn't know when. And when it did, it came fast. It began in the bakeries. Flour dust hung thick in the warm rooms, catching the light like smoke. One morning, the apprentices found their master slumped against the oven door, face slick, breath gone. By noon, every bakery on that street was silent. The loaves still rose in the heat, perfuming the air with the scent of labor unfinished. The fever moved with greater cunning this time. It no longer struck in great waves, but in flickers, here a child, there a merchant, a priest mid-prayer, a guard mid-step. It waited between moments of calm, striking when the mind dared to forget. It sleeps, people said. It listens. The physicians, once so sure in their ignorance, no longer pretended to know its shape. They called it the second visitation, though many whispered it had never left at all. The king's council debated whether to flee the capital again. Some urged him north, others to Calais, but Henry refused to abandon London twice. He sealed the palace gates, ordered barrels of pitch burned in the courtyards, and commanded that the court's musicians play through the night to drown the sound of the dying. Outside the palace, the air shimmered, the streets glowed with heat, the stones themselves sweating beneath the sun. Men stripped to their shirts, working with rags over their faces, burying the new dead in shallow graves that steamed by morning. The priests who had survived the first plague now preached from windows, unwilling to descend among their congregations. "The Lord is testing us," they called, their voices thin above the hum of flies. Yet some found the silence worse than the fever. The poets who had survived the first outbreak wrote that the second had no scent of despair, only fatigue, a dull resignation that soaked into the bones. People no longer begged to live, they simply waited to see if they would. And when the wind finally shifted again, carrying the first hint of coolness from the sea, the city dared to hope. But hope, in London, had become its own sickness. The heat would come again. It always did. The fever's second breath reached Oxford before summer was half born. The colleges, once filled with debate and music, now echoed with coughing and the scrape of chairs hurriedly pushed away. The halls that had thrummed with Latin disputations and laughter grew still, their windows shuttered against the shimmering air. It was said that even knowledge could not withstand the sweat, that wisdom, like flesh, decayed when the body burned. In the library of Magdalen College, scholars continued their work at first. They dipped quills in ink with trembling hands, pretending the air was not thick with the smell of sweat and parchment. But one morning, a lecturer named William Simmons collapsed mid-sentence while reciting from Galen. His students carried him outside into the courtyard, fanning him with pages torn from his own book. By the time the chapel bell tolled, he was still. The wind turned his lecture notes into ghosts, scattering them across the cloisters. The university masters called for purification rituals. Fires were lit in every quad, their smoke curling against the grey stone like incense. Students threw herbs into the flames, sage, rosemary, and rue, while chanting psalms between coughs. The air shimmered with heat and faith. But faith, as always, burned quicker than wood. Within a week, the lectures ceased. The professors locked their doors and sealed their rooms with wax. In Balliol, a young scholar named Thomas de Vere recorded the events in a cramped hand. "We thought the plague a lesson," he wrote, "but this is a test without mercy. It kills faster than reason." He described nights when the fever made the walls of the dormitory tremble and the air hum like bees in the skull. Students began to flee under moonlight, their books left open on desks, their beds still warm. By dawn, the city's gates stood open, and the streets were littered with pages. The few who stayed lived like monks. Meals were taken apart, prayers whispered through cloth. The Chancellor forbade gatherings larger than 3 souls. The great debates that once drew nobles and poets were replaced by silence so complete one could hear the quills drying on the tables. The bells of the university chapels rang only for death. When the fever reached the college kitchens, the cooks refused to serve the meals. Hunger joined the scholars in their cells. One by one, they weakened, not from sickness, but from solitude. The gardens grew wild, ivy spilling through the cloisters, reclaiming the stones. In the evenings, those who survived sat beneath the archways and watched the sunset gild the towers. The light, soft and gold, looked almost merciful. By September, the university was deserted. Books lay open to half-read pages, ink pots dry, candles burnt to pools of wax. The great doors of the Bodleian Library stood ajar, sighing in the wind. Those who returned months later said the rooms smelled of paper and salt, as though the sea had passed through and left its memory behind. Knowledge had not died, but it had fallen silent, its guardians carried away by the same heat that devoured their words. And in that silence, the stones of Oxford seemed to whisper a lesson older than any text, that no mind, however bright, could outthink the breath of death. The fever travelled with coin faster than with breath. From the first markets of spring, merchants spread it, unknowingly, pouches of silver slick with sweat changing hands like curses. By midsummer, London's wealthiest traders began to realize that the same prosperity that had once gilded their names was now their undoing. They had built their empires on movement, on goods flowing in and out of the city, and the sweat moved with them. Among these men was Richard Corley, a merchant of fine wool and wine, whose ships still crossed the channel when others dared not. He told himself that risk was profit, that fear was for lesser men. "The fever feeds on the poor," he said, pouring himself imported claret in his counting house as the windows dripped with condensation. "Gold has its own medicine." But when his youngest clerk collapsed beside the ledger, face shining as though oiled, the lie cracked. The next day, he summoned an alchemist and a priest. The priest sprinkled holy water over the scales and the books. The alchemist lit candles of brimstone and muttered of vapors and humors. Both men fled before nightfall, their shadows stretching long across the merchant's door. Corley was left alone with his barrels of wine and bales of wool. the smell of sulfur and sanctity mingling in the air. Trade did not stop, even as the city gasped. Ships still unloaded at the wharves under cover of night, their crews masked with vinegar-soaked cloths. Coins passed from trembling hands to trembling hands, and the fever followed each exchange. Goods that should have traveled to Bruges and Calais were sold instead in secret, in back rooms dimly lit and tightly sealed. There, merchants bargained not just for silk and spice, but for survival. "Deliver me one shipment free of sickness," Corley said to a Flemish trader one night, his voice shaking with drink and dread, "and I will give you my house, my servants, my name." The foreigner smiled, too calm, too clean. "The air has no price," he said. "It finds even kings." He took Corley's gold, but left behind a small carved charm, a saint's face twisted in prayer. Within a week, Corley's ships stopped returning. The crews vanished at sea or were burned at anchor by fearful port towns. His warehouse grew silent. He paced its aisles by candlelight, whispering figures to himself as though the numbers might somehow forgive him. When the fever finally found him, it came not with heat but with a chill. He clutched at his ledgers until the ink bled across the pages, the numbers dissolving into stains that looked almost like tears. When the neighbors dared to enter, they found him slumped over the table, surrounded by gold coins gone dark with tarnish. The saint's charm lay cracked beside him. They buried him without prayer, too afraid to linger, and locked the counting house behind them. In the months that followed, merchants began to weigh their coins with gloves, to wash them in wine before use. But still, the fever found its way into every transaction, as though the city itself demanded payment, and the price, as always, was higher than anyone could afford. By the time the fever's second summer reached its height, London's skyline had changed, not in its shape, but in its eyes. Every house, every manor, tavern, and tenement had sealed its windows shut. The city no longer looked outward. It stared inward, blind and afraid. Behind each darkened pane, families huddled together, breathing the same stale air, waiting for the sound of footsteps that would tell them it had come for them next. The physicians had told them that the air was poison, that it was not touch nor water but wind itself that carried death. So they hammered boards across the casements, stuffed the cracks with rags soaked in vinegar and rosewater, and prayed that no breath from the street would enter. The smell of vinegar became London's new perfume. It hung in the alleys, it soaked the clothes, it stained the walls. The scent meant safety, or at least the illusion of it. Inside one such house, in Bishopsgate, lived a candlemaker named Mary Holt and her 2 sons. Their neighbors were long gone. They had nailed their shutters so tightly that no light entered but the trembling glow of the tallow lamps. The boys' drawings on the wall turned from ships and animals to crosses and stars. "The angels will see us," the youngest said. But the older one shook his head. "No one can see through the dark." Each morning, Mary lit a new candle and placed it in the window, a tiny rebellion against the blackness that pressed in from outside. By the 3rd week, wax dripped like tears down the shutters, hardening into pale rivulets that looked like frost. The air inside grew heavy, the heat unbroken. At night, she could hear coughing from the house next door, first the father, then the mother, then silence. She told her boys it was thunder. The city itself began to suffocate. With every window sealed, the air grew thicker, fouler. Fires burned low, unable to breathe. Bread would not rise, ale soured in the cask. The few who ventured into the streets said the houses looked alive, walls sweating, roofs sagging, their chimneys sighing weakly against the unmoving sky. Rumors spread of people sealing themselves in too well, of families found months later, untouched by the fever but dead all the same. Their candles melted to stubs. The watchmen no longer knocked. They simply marked the doors with chalk crosses and moved on. One night, Mary's youngest son woke gasping, the air too thin to fill his lungs. She tore away a board, desperate for a breeze. The night wind rushed in, cool, sweet, treacherous. By morning, the fever had found them. Days later, a passerby noticed their candles still burning in the window. the only light on the street. When it finally guttered out, the darkness returned, complete and merciful. The houses of London had turned into coffins that could breathe only a little, and sometimes not at all. The people had saved themselves from the wind, but not from what waited within it. The silence that made even life feel like holding one's breath. He had spent his life chasing order through chaos, counting heartbeats, weighing breath, cataloguing the mysteries of flesh. Dr. Matthew Arden had been one of the few who refused to flee London when the sweat first came. He believed knowledge could conquer terror. That belief, like everything else that summer, would be reduced to ash. His house on Paternoster Row had become a workshop of fever. The rooms were lined with bottles, jars, and parchment scrawled with observations. He measured everything: the color of sweat, the rhythm of pulse, the hours between shiver and silence. The body is a clock, he told his apprentices. If we learn the gears, we may yet turn it back. But the clock kept stopping, and his apprentices kept dying. At first, he recorded their deaths as data. Stage 3, he wrote beside one name. Perspiration, excessive, heart laboring. Beside another, tremors cease abruptly, eyes remain open. But by the 10th entry, his handwriting faltered, the margins filled with smudges, with prayers disguised as notes. When his last apprentice collapsed mid-sentence, the doctor worked through the night, applying compresses, bleeding the boy's arm, whispering encouragement to a face already cooling. At dawn, he laid him in the garden among the herbs and went back inside. The house grew quieter. The air thickened with vinegar, smoke, and despair. Arden began to speak to himself as he worked. "It is not contagion," he muttered, pacing between the tables. "It is air itself revolting against us. The body breathes treason." His theories grew strange, frantic. He dissected birds to study their lungs, then burned them to test the purity of their smoke. Neighbors saw the plumes rising from his chimney and crossed themselves, calling him the fire doctor. But the fever came for him too. It started as a heaviness behind his eyes, a slow pulse in his neck. He knew the signs, he had written them often enough. Still, he kept to his work, determined to leave the truth behind, to give the survivors something more than fear. His handwriting grew jagged, the ink dark with sweat. In the final days, the notes ceased to make sense. "The air remembers," he wrote. "It carries grief like pollen. Then, beneath it, it listens when I breathe." The night before he died, he set a fire in his hearth. One by one, he fed his papers to the flames, the diagrams, the ledgers, the lists of symptoms. He burned his failures, his discoveries, and his hope that the world could be measured. The parchment curled and blackened, carrying its secrets upward in sparks. When the neighbors broke down his door days later, they found only the ash of his work and the faint smell of scorched rosemary. The hearth still glowed faintly, as if the fire had waited for them. On the mantel rested his final note, written in a hand both calm and resigned. "I have found the cure. It is forgetting." And so he was buried without honors, his name fading with his words. But for weeks afterward, those who passed his house swore they could smell burnt parchment in the wind, like knowledge dying quietly, one breath at a time. It confounded every living soul who tried to explain it. Plagues had always come with rats, the old chroniclers said. They had learned to expect the black tide of fur and teeth that heralded sickness, the scurrying across rooftops, the gnawing beneath floors, the squeal that meant death was near. But this time, there were none. The sweat had no messengers. No fleas, no beasts, no sign of decay before the dying began. It was as though the fever rose straight from the ground, or from the lungs of England itself. By late summer, the city was too quiet for comfort. No scratching in the walls, no movement in the gutters. The cats prowled restlessly, confused by the absence of their prey. Horses stamped nervously in their stalls, whinnying at shadows that did not move. The people began to whisper that the rats had carried the sickness away with them, that they had fled, frightened of what they had unleashed. Others claimed the opposite, that the rats had been the guardians of man, and without them, the balance of the world had slipped. In Southwark, an old priest named Father Whitcomb preached that the rats had taken England's sins to sea. He spoke from the steps of his church to a handful of starving parishioners. "The creatures are God's couriers," he said, voice cracking. "They bore our wickedness on their backs, and when they drowned, our guilt sank with them. What remains now is the fire of purification." He died 2 days later, his cassock soaked through, his sermon still echoing in the rafters. Physicians, baffled, searched for meaning where reason failed. They dissected pigeons, trapped dogs, even opened the graves of the freshly dead to look for worms that were not there. They found nothing. No cause, no carrier, no pattern. The sickness came and went, like a breath, swift, invisible, final. "It does not crawl," one doctor wrote. "It passes." The word lingered in his notes like a curse. The absence of rats made the city eerily clean. Markets no longer buzzed with their rustle. Grain stores stood untouched, and the docks, once alive with the sound of tiny claws, echoed instead with the groans of the dying. Without the constant scurry of vermin, the silence thickened until it felt unnatural, almost holy. People began to speak in whispers, afraid to disturb whatever invisible thing had taken their place. In a narrow alley near Street Dunstan's, a watchman named Hugh spotted the first rat seen in weeks. It sat on the edge of a drain, still as stone, watching him with black, glimmering eyes. He called to it softly, almost kindly. When he stepped closer, it turned and disappeared into the darkness. The next morning, the watchman was dead. Word spread fast. The people began to pray for the rats to return, but they never did. The city stayed clean and silent, and the fever kept moving through the air unchallenged. It no longer needed vessels of fur and claw. It had found a better hostman himself. From then on, the silence of London carried its own kind of dread. The absence of scurrying, the stillness of night, these were no longer comforts but omens. The rats were gone, but the plague remained, reminding everyone that sometimes nature withdraws not from disgust, but from surrender. In the gilded chambers of Westminster, truth had become treason. To speak the word plague was to invite ruin. To whisper sweat was to risk exile. The Crown had decided England was not dying. It was merely unwell. Messengers were forbidden to use the word in letters. Scribes were ordered to alter records, and any proclamation of sickness required the king's seal. The monarch's will, not God's, would define what was real. The courtiers obeyed, as courtiers always do. They learned to smile as the fever spread, to toast the king's health while servants fainted at their feet. The great halls were filled with false laughter and perfume thick enough to choke. The courtiers' silks hid sweat, their painted faces concealed pallor. The palace had become a theatre of denial, every gesture rehearsed against the dread that waited just beyond the door. When the royal physicians begged to quarantine the court, the king's chancellor struck their petition from the record. "There shall be no talk of contagion," he declared. "England's heart is pure." A week later, he was dead, found slumped over his desk, his robes damp, the ink of his unfinished decree still wet beneath his hand. His name was never entered in the official rolls. To the outside world, the Crown maintained its pageantry. Decrees were issued, taxes collected, and ambassadors received, though every handshake was followed by the soft rustle of linen gloves being burned. The city's walls were hung with banners proclaiming God's favor upon the new Tudor line. "England endures," they read in gold thread. But beneath the banners, the people coughed. When petitions from London's guilds reached the palace pleas for aid, for bread, for burial grounds, they were returned unopened. The royal seal remained unbroken, as if the wax itself could hold back the truth. The heralds who carried the messages often vanished before reaching the city gates. Some said they fell ill on the road. Others whispered they were silenced before they could speak. The king himself began to vanish too. Weeks passed without a glimpse of him. Rumor said he had retreated to Windsor, others that he wandered the gardens at night, mask upon his face, muttering to unseen spirits. The palace continued to function without him, powered by fear and habit, Orders came stamped with his crest, though no one had seen him sign. At last, one morning, the court awoke to find black cloth draped over the palace gates. A servant had died in the king's chamber, though no one knew his name. The guards burned his body before sunrise. When asked for explanation, the steward of the household replied, "It was an error of ventilation." No one laughed. Outside the walls, the people had begun to speak a new name for the fever. They called it the King's Silence. They said the sickness grew stronger with every lie told about it, that each denial was another breath feeding its fire. Within Westminster's locked halls, the courtiers still toasted the monarch each night, their glasses trembling in their hands. "To England's health," they said, and somewhere deep in the sealed chambers where truth had no air, the silence answered back. Long before the bells fell silent, London had measured its pulse by sound, the clatter of carts, the calls of vendors, and, above all, the music. It poured from taverns and church steps alike, from minstrels beneath archways and noble banquets glittering with lute and drum. But as the fever deepened, sound itself began to falter. Songs that once soared now trembled. Melodies broke midway, and the air that carried them thickened until no voice could pass through without strain. The royal musicians were the first to notice. In the great hall at Westminster, they tuned their instruments before a banquet that never came. Their fingers slipped on strings slick with sweat. Their flutes hissed instead of sang. When they played, the notes hung heavy in the room, as though reluctant to leave the safety of wood and breath. Guests forced smiles, pretending to enjoy what none could bear to hear. "The music sounds ill," someone whispered. In the city, the taverns that had once burst with laughter now hosted only silence. The fiddlers packed away their bows. The singers folded their throats into muteness. The owners paid them in bread and pity, telling them the air had turned against art. "Every song brings death," one drunk murmured before collapsing on the tavern floor, his final exhale carrying a half-remembered tune. The churches fared no better. Choir boys who had sung through war and plague now stood trembling at the pulpits, their voices cracking mid-hymn. The choirmaster of Street, Paul's an aging man who had survived 3 outbreaks, insisted they continue, that silence itself was blasphemy, but each note they raised seemed to echo back weaker, thinner, swallowed by something unseen. One morning, during matins, the smallest boy fainted before the final verse of the Te Deum. The others stopped singing and never began again. Musicians tried to adapt. Some turned to bells, hoping metal could outlast flesh. They rang smaller handbells in the streets, not for mourning but for rhythm, as though summoning courage. Yet even the bells lost their voice. The clappers stuck. The sound dulled. What once had been music now resembled breathing, strained, uneven, human. In Cheapside, a blind harpist named Elias became a ghost of the city's former joy. He sat at the corner near the market, plucking strings that no longer answered. His harp had warped in the heat, the gut chords stretched loose and flat. Still he played, the sound faint and wrong. "The air eats it," he told those who passed. "It eats the sound before it reaches your ears." When he died, slumped over his harp, the people left him there until evening, unable to tell where the music ended and silence began. The king's court mourned the loss of melody with a masquerade of forced gaiety. They danced to nothing, feet shuffling in the echo of forgotten rhythms. Servants clapped in time, though there was no beat. It was said that the queen herself waltzed alone one night in her chamber, her perfume swirling like music through the air, her steps whispering across the floor. London, once a city of harmony, had fallen mute. Even the wind that moved through its streets carried no tune, only a low hum, as though the earth itself had begun to grieve. And somewhere, perhaps deep within the fever's still heart, the music waited, suspended and unplayed, for a world brave enough to listen again. The summer broke not with sunlight but with rain, endless, heavy and unclean. It began one night in June, a slow drizzle that gathered at the edges of the roofs and trickled down the city's hollow face. By morning, it had turned into a torrent. The heavens seemed to have opened not in mercy but in mourning. The cobbled streets became streams, the gutters ran like veins, and London bled water from every crack. At first, the people welcomed it. They believed the rain might wash the sickness away, cleanse the stones of fever and fear. Mothers lifted their children to the open sky, letting the drops fall onto their faces like baptism. Men poured buckets of it over their heads, shouting, "The Lord sends healing." But as the days passed and the rain grew colder, thicker, and strangely metallic to the taste, hope curdled into dread. The fever did not fade, it deepened. The rain carried everything with it, the ashes from burned linens, the oils of decay, the blood of the newly dead. It pooled in courtyards, seeped into cellars, and soaked the graves until the ground bubbled. The Thames rose, swallowing boats and bridges alike. The sound of it filled every silence, a constant murmur that drowned both prayer and weeping. Windows began to leak, walls began to sweat, houses grew soft beneath the constant assault. The shutters, long nailed against the air, warped under the damp, paint peeled, beams sagged, and in the night, the sound of dripping water became unbearable, a rhythm that matched the heartbeat of the city's slow death. In the poorer quarters, roofs collapsed, families huddled together beneath soaked blankets, their candles sputtering out one by one. "It is God's second flood," they whispered, but he forgot to bring the ark. They were not far wrong. The graves on the city's edge had burst open, their contents lifted by the rain. At dawn, the carters found bones scattered in the streets, washed clean as ivory. Even the palace was not spared. The royal tapestries, once fragrant with herbs, hung damp and heavy against the stone. The king's council met in chambers that dripped constantly, their ink running down the parchment as they tried to write decrees that no one would obey. A physician suggested that the rain itself had turned sick, that it carried the same heat that burns in men's blood. His words were met with silence, though none dared drink from the rain barrels again. By July, mould bloomed across the walls of London like a second skin. The air smelled of wet earth and rot. No one could tell where the river ended and the streets began. The rain had become a mirror for the city, grey, swollen, and restless. When at last the downpour eased, it left behind a silence so deep it startled the living. The streets steamed in the weak sun, the air thick with the stench of soaked decay. The fever had not been washed away, it had only learned to swim, and as the last drops slid down the eaves and vanished into the cracks, the people of London realized the truth that chilled them more than the rain ever could. Heaven had wept for 40 days, and still God had not looked down. By the third year of the sweat, even the physicians had learned fear. They had once strode through plague and pestilence in robes of confidence, armed with their pouches of herbs and their Latin prayers. But the sweat was different. It mocked knowledge. It waited in the air, invisible and patient, slipping past walls, curtains, and masks as though laughter made of heat. So the doctors began to dress for battle. They wore armor now, thin plates of steel over leather, masks of hammered brass fitted with slits for the eyes, gloves dipped in wax. Some carried short swords, not for defense but for distance, using them to lift linens or turn the dying onto their backs. When they walked through the streets, the sound of metal followed them, a slow clinking like the tolling of faint bells. Children called them iron ghosts. The sick crossed themselves when they passed. The first to fashion such protection was Dr. Simon Kelway, a man once celebrated for his learning. He claimed that the heat of the sweat could not pass through cold iron, that armor, long the shield of knights, might now defend the body of a healer. His idea spread faster than the fever itself. Soon, the sight of gleaming figures moving through the fog became common, half men, half spectres, their breath echoing through the hollows of their masks. Kelway's apprentices recorded his every step. He would approach the dying with careful ceremony, his movements slow, deliberate, like a priest before an altar. He sprinkled vinegar on his boots, spoke to no one, and never removed his mask, not even to eat. He said it was his second skin. The air seeks skin, he told his students. Deny it flesh, and it cannot feed. But even iron has seams. After weeks of success, Kelway began to cough. He ignored it at first, working longer hours, convinced his armor had betrayed no weakness. Then, one morning, his students found him collapsed beside his furnace. His armor was still sealed, his mask still in place. When they pried it open, steam hissed out, and his face was as red as flame. The armor had become his coffin, his body cooked within the protection he had trusted most. Others refused to learn the lesson. They reforged their suits thicker, heavier, sealing themselves further from the world. Some survived a while longer, their armor shining brighter than the dying faces around them. But soon, the very weight of their invention crushed them. They could barely move, barely breathe. The protection they had built became a prison. In time, the armored doctors vanished from the streets altogether. Their empty suits were found leaning in corners, glinting faintly in the torchlight. People began to hang garlands around them, calling them guardians of the dead. Children placed flowers in their gauntlets and whispered wishes through the visor slits. And so London was left with its strangest saints, hollow figures of steel, standing motionless in doorways long after their wearers were gone. Their armor still gleamed when the morning sun returned, and for a brief, merciful moment, the light made them look alive. But when the wind passed, their joints groaned softly, like men sighing in their sleep. It was among the smallest that the terror of the sweat became most vivid. Children, once thought protected by innocence, now burned hotter than any adult, their tiny bodies betraying the fever's cruel hand with unnatural speed. Parents watched in disbelief as sons and daughters, hale and laughing in the morning, were reduced to trembling, sweating figures by nightfall. Their skin shone with a strange, damp luminescence in candlelight, as if the very heat within them sought escape. In a narrow lane near the river, a mother named Alice Harper carried her youngest, Thomas, whose cheeks had grown unnaturally flushed. He had played with other children in the courtyard only hours before, chasing shadows and crows with carefree delight. Now he shivered uncontrollably, hands clutched to his chest. His skin seemed to glisten, and every breath he drew rattled, shallow and urgent. Alice wrapped him in linen and vinegar-soaked cloths, whispering prayers she no longer felt. Across London, the same scenes unfolded. Children's laughter grew scarce. Those still alive trembled in corners, their eyes wide, staring at walls or shadows that moved too slowly to be alive. Parents fled from houses where one child had already fallen, seeking refuge in streets flooded with water, hoping that distance might confuse the sickness. But distance offered no protection. The sweat crept, patient and invisible, following the rhythm of breath rather than the steps of feet. Physicians tried to study the phenomenon. They measured the glowing children, weighed them, took their pulse. Some theorized that the fever produced a strange chemical reaction within the body, a light born of heat and sweat. Others whispered darker thoughts that the air had chosen these small forms as its vessels because innocence was easy to shape, easy to consume. Every experiment failed. The children's glowing intensified, their bodies drenched, their tiny hands curling like dried leaves. The streets became full of whispered warnings. "Do not touch them," neighbors said. "The fire is in their skin." Mothers walked with their own children, suspended in arms or slings, afraid to meet the gaze of others, afraid to breathe the same air. Some tried to mark their wards with chalk symbols or charms, but no measure could prevent the fever's approach. It moved faster than footsteps, faster than love or fear. At night, the candles flickered against the pallor of fevered cheeks. Children cried in low, quivering tones, their voices thin as wind through the rafters. Parents covered them with blankets that could not absorb the heat. They prayed, they whispered lullabies, they stroked hair damp with sweat until their own hands became soaked. And still, the glow pulsed, relentless, like light escaping from some internal flame. In some houses, the children died side by side, Parents dared not remove them from the sheets, leaving them as they had fallen, wrapped in the smell of vinegar and sorrow. The neighbors, afraid to enter, could only hear the soft, uneven rhythm of little hearts, until even that ceased. By the next morning, the lanes were quiet again. The faint shimmer of glow lingered briefly on the damp streets, a memory of the fire that had passed through. London's adults would remember it for years, not the laughter of children, but the way their tiny bodies had burned like lanterns, bright and brief, before fading into silence. The city of York, perched upon its hills and winding streets, had once been a place of commerce and song. Merchants' voices echoed through the shambles, minstrels played beneath timbered halls, and the river Ouse glimmered like silver under the summer sun. But when the sweat crept northward from London, the city became shrouded in a different kind of light, one not of day or candle, but of smoke. It began quietly. Chimneys belched grey spirals that clung to the stone walls, drifting down narrow alleys where children had once played. Housewives burned bundles of herbs, believing the smoke would purify the air, chase away the invisible fever that crept through their homes. Sage, rosemary, wormwood, each leaf scorched until the aroma became acrid and suffocating. The first bodies, those of tradesmen and apprentices, were wrapped and carried into the street, their linens smouldering in a futile attempt at protection. The hospitals, few and overcrowded, became furnaces. Physicians piled herbs into braziers, fanning the smoke toward beds where the fevered lay. Apprentices learned to inhale cautiously, fearing the breath they drew might carry the very sickness they hoped to combat. Candles burned low, their flames bending toward the rising tendrils of smoke, as though drawn to some secret warmth. By the third week, even the air outside was thick with it, as if the city itself exhaled in laboring sighs. In the great hall of York, the mayor convened a council of the remaining guilds. Each man entered with mask and gloves, leaning against the walls to avoid one another's breath. They lit fires in the corners, filling the chamber with dense smoke. "The city must act," one whispered, "but we have no guidance, no knowledge, only the scent of dying." Each face glimmered in the haze, sweat streaking beneath powdered foreheads. The council debated endlessly who would tend the sick, who would bury the dead, who could be spared. Even the children were not spared. Tiny forms huddled in corners, coughing into rags, their eyes wide and luminous from fever. Mothers hung herbs over the cradles, letting smoke drift through the slats of beds, as though warding off the inevitable. Some infants died while the herbs burned low, their breaths heavy, soft and final. The smoke did not protect them. It only carried the scent of despair further into the city. At night, the streets glowed faintly with embers, braziers lining the alleys like watchful sentinels. The river reflected the haze, silvered and sluggish, carrying with it whispers of the dead upstream and downstream. Those who dared walk along the Ouse shivered beneath the heat and the smell. Dogs whimpered, abandoned carts creaked in the empty streets, and the wind carried the smoke like a living thing, thick with the memory of the fevered bodies it had passed. By the end of the month, York had learned a new rhythm. Smoke curled constantly from every hearth, every window, every brazier. The city no longer smelled of bread or wood. It smelled of the living, attempting to ward off what could not be seen. And through it all, the sweat moved silently, following the wisps of smoke into homes, into hearts, into beds. York had become a city of grey spirals and silent prayers. The smoke rose endlessly over the rooftops, a shroud for the living and the dead alike, and the people whispered that even if the fever passed, the memory of it would hang there forever, heavier than any chimney stack, denser than any fog. It was a night that no one would forget, though many wished they could. The sky over London, which had once been a vault of silver stars, became a void. No twinkle, no shimmer, no familiar constellations to guide the eyes of the fearful. The heavens seemed to have disappeared entirely, swallowed by an invisible weight that pressed down on the city. People paused in doorways, heads tilted upward, breath held, as though the darkness itself might devour them whole. The wind had fallen that evening, leaving the city cloaked in an unnatural stillness. The river ran sluggish beneath the bridges, its surface reflecting nothing. The cobbled streets, slick with the sweat of the living and the drizzle of earlier rain, seemed to vanish into the shadow of the sky. Even the dogs stopped barking, the cats ceased their nightly prowls. It was as if the world itself had inhaled and refused to exhale. In the alleys of Southwark, children cried softly, huddled close to mothers who whispered prayers that had lost their meaning. Fathers, stripped of reason, hammered at doors and gates, shouting for neighbors who had long since fled. The air was thick with the scent of smoke and herbs. Rosemary, sage, juniper burned in frantic hope to ward off the fever that had taken so many lives. Yet the darkness above, infinite and absolute, seemed untouched by human endeavor. Within the city's great halls, the court was unusually silent. Candles flickered weakly, throwing long shadows across the tapestries. Courtiers leaned close to one another, afraid to breathe, their words swallowed before they could reach the ears of friends or enemies. The king himself was said to have paced the chamber, gloved hands pressed to his chest, eyes searching for the moon or a single star, any sign that the heavens still observed the city below. None came. Astronomers, those few who still survived, claimed that the sky had been obscured by a thick miasma, a sickness of the air itself, so dense it blocked even the faintest light. They carried globes and charts to windowsills, hoping to glimpse the positions of the planets, only to find the glass reflecting candle flames and nothing beyond. Some swore the stars had fled, horrified by what they saw beneath them. A city that sweated and trembled, a people gripped by fear, and a pestilence that moved faster than knowledge could follow. The hospitals were worst. Patients lay in darkened rooms, their skin glistening in the weak candlelight, eyes wide and fevered. Nurses and attendants moved silently, afraid to speak, afraid that breath itself might carry the invisible terror. The only sounds were the soft rattle of chests and the occasional drop of sweat from a brow onto the floor, the rhythm of life and death intertwined. By midnight, the city felt smaller, crushed beneath the void above. People whispered that the stars had been stolen by the sweat, or perhaps that heaven had turned its face away. They pressed their children to their chests and held hands in silence, listening to the rhythm of their own pulses, the only measure of time and safety left. When dawn finally broke, the first light crept over the horizon like a timid promise. The sky slowly revealed pale hints of color, gray, blue, and the faintest silver. But the stars did not return. London had survived the night, but it had lost something greater than light. The heavens themselves seemed altered, a reflection of a city that had stared too long into the darkness, and of a plague that would haunt both sky and street for years to come. By the time the sweat had reached the northern towns, it had learned to ride on words. Letters, once carriers of learning and commerce, became unwitting vessels of fear. From Cambridge, scribes recorded the horror that had begun to seep through the colleges, their ink trembling across the page as their hands shook from exhaustion and dread. What had been correspondence became a confession of terror, each letter a testament to the invisible hand that now ruled England. The first letters arrived at the homes of relatives in London, carried by messengers too afraid to speak. They were sealed tightly, wax stamped with the university crest, yet the seal offered no protection. Families opened them slowly, as though a sudden glance might release the fever into the room. Inside, the pages were crowded with careful handwriting, reporting the deaths of scholars, apprentices, and servants alike. They spoke of classrooms abandoned, lectures left mid-sentence, and libraries emptied of all but the dust and the faint scent of ink. One letter, sent by the Chancellor himself, described a night in which the fever had struck through the dormitories of Magdalen College. Students had huddled together for warmth, clutching sheets and each other, only to awaken sweating, trembling, and already half dead. By morning, the corridors were littered with bodies, some still clutching quills as though attempting to finish a sentence they would never complete. The writer closed his report with a single desperate plea: "Pray for us, for no one else can." Merchants and courtiers who received these letters were unnerved. The ink carried more than words, it carried dread. Each line seemed to breathe, thick with fear, the edges of the parchment curling as though recoiling from the news. Mothers read aloud to children, only to have them collapse from terror before reaching the end. Fathers who attempted to decipher the writing covered their mouths to stifle curses, knowing that even breath might be compromised. The letters themselves began to arrive with strange irregularity. Some were lost in transit, found days later sodden and smeared, the words illegible. Others bore the faint scent of vinegar or herbs pressed between the pages, attempts by the scribes to keep the fever at bay. Yet no precaution could prevent the news from arriving, or the fear it carried from spreading faster than the plague itself. In Cambridge, the scholars who remained attempted to send remedies along with their warnings, tinctures, powders, and recipes for herbal washes. But these items often arrived too late, consumed by the same panic that had emptied the streets. The sweat did not respect ink or bottle. It passed silently, invisible, and indiscriminate. By autumn, the city learned to dread the letters more than the knock at the door. They carried the sound of distant coughs, the weight of absences, the echo of classrooms emptied and lives extinguished. Each envelope became a warning and a reminder. The plague traveled not just in air, but through the very lifeblood of knowledge. And still, despite every precaution, the letters arrived. London's people read them with trembling hands, folded them carefully, and laid them aside, knowing that the words might survive, but they themselves could not. The sweat had made ink and paper part of its domain, and in every line, the city felt the presence of death inching closer. The sweat did not distinguish between wealth and poverty, though those who had once believed themselves protected discovered it with horror. In the stately homes of the nobility, where gilded furniture and silk draperies once promised safety, the fever found easy entry. The rich had long relied on servants, sealed windows, and scented oils, believing that luxury could act as armor against the world's dangers. But the sweat was no respecter of status. It sought out flesh, wherever it might hide. In one manor near Westminster, Lord Radcliffe prepared for the summer, as he always had banquets arranged, tapestries dusted, his chamber filled with candles of beeswax and herbs. The windows were sealed with boards, the floors scrubbed with vinegar, and yet, by the third morning, his valet collapsed mid-step, drenched in sweat, eyes wide with terror. Lord Radcliffe's own daughter, 17 and pale as frost, shivered uncontrollably while clutching a silver cup of water. By dusk, they were both dead. The servants dared not carry them to the street, fearing that the act itself might summon the fever into the rest of the household. The same scenes repeated across the city. Merchants who had hoped coin might shield them found their finest clothes soaked in sweat. Wine that had been imported at great expense could not cleanse the air, nor could it soothe the fevered lips of those who drank it. The walls of townhouses began to sweat alongside their inhabitants, a subtle mist clinging to tapestries and floors. Candles burned faster than ever, yet their flames did nothing to ward off the invisible tide. Physicians arrived with tinctures, powders, and careful instructions, only to find the rich dying faster than they could be tended. Gold, silk, and perfume could not buy life. The King's Council debated endlessly about sending the wealthiest abroad to estates in the countryside, believing distance might grant immunity. But even the open air offered little protection. Courtiers who fled estates miles from the city returned with fever in less than a week. The sweat moved too swiftly, carried not by shadow or rat, but by the very breath of the living. In their desperation, the wealthy tried everything. Linen was boiled, rooms fumigated, servants washed repeatedly in vinegar and rose water. They chained windows with iron, sprinkled ashes across floors, hung herbs from every arch. Some took to sleeping on bare boards, believing that exposure might teach the body to resist. Others sprinkled powders over their sheets, whispering incantations in Latin as they covered their faces. None of it mattered. The fever passed through walls, beneath floors, even into sealed coffers. By late summer, the streets themselves bore the evidence of the rich's vulnerability. Palatial houses were abandoned, doors hanging open, the scent of burned herbs lingering in the air. Carriages left standing in courtyards were claimed by the wind and rain, their wheels warped by neglect. The people who had once looked down upon the poor, believing wealth a shield, now joined them in fear, coughing into handkerchiefs and watching their servants vanish one by one. And so, London learned that the sweat did not spare. In mansions and hovels alike, in candlelit chambers and damp alleys, the fever claimed all. Gold could not buy life, silk could not hide it, and power could not command mercy. The rich learned, as everyone eventually would, that death did not knock politely. It entered silently, and it waited for no one. The halls of governance, once filled with debate, persuasion, and the rustle of parchment, had fallen quiet. Parliament, that seat of England's deliberation, became a chamber of shadows. The sweat had infiltrated every corner, every mouth, and every mind. Members, once loud and imperious, whispered their words to each other as though speech itself might carry the fever from one body to the next. The great hall, which had hosted proclamations and counsel for generations, now echoed only with the soft, measured steps of cautious feet. It began with absence. One member failed to arrive, citing illness in a distant manner. Then another, a merchant lord from the north, collapsed mid-prayer outside Westminster, his body still warm with sweat when carried inside. The clerk who recorded attendance found his own pulse racing as he ticked names off the list. Some of the absent were already dead by the time their seats were marked empty. The parliamentarian who arrived first did so wrapped in layers of linen and waxed gloves, carrying a small brazier that smoked with burning herbs. Debate became impossible. Any raised voice sounded dangerous. Even the click of a quill or the rustle of a robe seemed amplified in the tense, humid air. Proposals were read from a distance, then repeated to the speaker's own lips for clarity. Decisions were made not by persuasion, but by caution, by avoiding contact, by speaking as little as possible. The chamber became a theatre of restraint, every gesture deliberate, every word measured, every breath weighed. The speaker himself, a man who had once commanded respect with booming authority, now whispered behind his mask. He held consultations in the gallery, away from his peers, speaking to no one in particular, scribbling notes that few would ever read. One morning, the clerk found him collapsed over the podium, his wax mask sticky with sweat, eyes wide and staring. When he was carried away, silence reigned more complete than ever before. The laws of England were still being written, but they no longer flowed from reason or debate. They flowed from fear. Ordinances forbade gatherings, limited travel, and mandated the burning of soiled linens. But these rules were enforced inconsistently, carried in trembling hands, and often ignored because the messengers themselves had succumbed. Parliament functioned less as a legislative body than as a skeleton of civility, a ritualized reminder that governance could not halt death. Outside, London watched the great hall with a mixture of fear and awe. Smoke from braziers rose from every window. The air was thick with vinegar and herbs, carrying the faint murmur of voices that might have been prayers. Citizens said the building itself was holding its breath, waiting for the fever to pass through, and for many, it felt as though it already had. By the end of the month, the Parliament of Silence had become legend. Laws existed on paper, but the men who would debate them were gone. The chambers held shadows in place of figures, echoes in place of speech, and the city understood a new truth, that power could not command the air, nor reason halt the fever. England had learned that silence itself could become authority, and that even those who governed were not immune to the unyielding reach of the sweat. In the early years of the sweat, letters and messages had carried more than words. They had carried the fear of the city, the smell of vinegar, and the invisible breath of the fever itself. By the third summer, the couriers of London had become the city's most tragic figures, moving through streets and alleys like shadows, entrusted with messages that few dared to read. Their pace was swift, but the air itself moved faster, always following, always waiting. Thomas Farringdon, a young courier of 20 summers, knew the routes of the city better than any man. He had ridden from Cheapside to Southwark countless times, carrying missives between merchants and nobles alike. But one morning, the first rider to die had already fallen mid-journey, his horse found wandering through Smithfield, its hooves bleeding in the mud. Farringdon had watched the body being carried into the river, swallowed by fog and horror. He could smell the sweat on the man long after he was gone. The couriers rode with masks over their mouths, gloves on their hands, boots laced tight to avoid contact with the cobbles. They carried letters wrapped in oilcloth, herbs tucked between the pages to repel the fever. Yet no measure could stop what had learned to move faster than precaution. By the third week, riders began disappearing along the streets, leaving horses alone in the rain, papers fluttering into gutters. Their disappearances were not mourned, only feared. Farringdon's final ride began at dusk. He had been entrusted with a letter from Cambridge, bound for the city council. The street was quiet, the fog thick as wool, the air sweet with the scent of burnt rosemary from neighboring households. He adjusted his mask, pressed his gloves against the reins, and urged his horse forward. The city seemed to hold its breath as he passed, windows shuttered, doors bolted, all life hushed beneath the heavy sky. He noticed it first in the wind, a strange heaviness that seemed to cling to his neck and wrists. Then came the smell, faint but unmistakable, metallic and warm. The sweat was there. It moved along the alleyways, brushing against the horse, curling around his legs like smoke. He spurred forward, hoping speed would outpace it. But there is no outrunning air that seeks the body. By midnight, he was found slumped across his saddle near Holborn, the letter still clutched in his hand. His horse nickered softly, its sides slick with sweat, but otherwise unharmed. No one could explain how the fever had touched him so swiftly. The city whispered that the message had been delivered in a final, tragic form, that the letter carried the fear and the sickness together, and neither could be avoided. When the bodies of the couriers were buried, families left their gloves and masks atop the graves. Children peered from windows, imagining the figures riding eternally through the fog, paper clutched in hand, carrying dread that would never end. The last ride of the couriers became a warning. Even those who served the city faithfully could not escape the reach of the sweat. From that day on, messages traveled only in silence, in whispered words passed across shutters and through closed doors. And the city learned to fear the wind itself, for it might carry more than scent or sound. It might carry death, swift, invisible, and unrelenting. By the late summer of the third year, the fever had grown restless. It had swept through London, York, Cambridge, and the northern towns, leaving silence and ash in its wake. But the sweat, as if unsatisfied with what it had claimed, began to drift southward, carried on the wind that swept over the hills and rivers toward Kent, Sussex, and the coasts of England, where trade and travel had once flourished. The first signs were subtle. A merchant walking from Dover to Canterbury reported a sudden heat behind his eyes, a tremor in his hands. By the next day, 2 of his apprentices had collapsed mid-step, their skin gleaming as though coated in a thin, invisible glaze. Villagers whispered that the fever had crossed the hills, invisible yet palpable, moving faster than sight or sound. It passed from household to household, never striking twice in the same pattern, as though it were testing its own reach. In the port towns along the Channel, sailors noticed something strange. Ships moored at the wharves lay empty. Decks were slick not just with rain but with the residue of fear. Men who had spent weeks at sea returned to find their families ill, their homes silent. Even the salt-laden wind off the sea carried no relief. It only intensified the burning heat in the bodies of the living. Merchants who tried to flee south were struck down on the road. Inns were abandoned, their windows sealed, fires dead. The air itself seemed to follow travellers, refusing to release them from its invisible grip. In Sussex, a noblewoman named Lady Beatrice attempted to protect her estate. She sealed windows with boards, burned herbs in every corner, and had her servants wear gloves and masks. Yet the fever did not care for protection. Her youngest son, barely 10, fell ill despite all measures. The physician she summoned, a man reputed to survive the northern outbreaks, worked feverishly, but could do nothing. By nightfall, the child's small hands were limp, his breath shallow, and the smell of vinegar and sweat filled the chamber. The king's council, receiving word of the southern spread, debated once more. Should they abandon London entirely? Should they attempt to contain the fever in the north? Couriers were sent, masked and gloved, but many did not return. Letters carried not just warning, but infection. The southern counties braced themselves, burning herbs, sealing doors, and whispering prayers to saints who seemed deaf to their pleas. In every village, people learned to move cautiously, to speak softly, to treat even familiar neighbors as threats. Town criers announced nothing but the hours, the price of grain, the tides of the river. No more news of the sick could be safely shared. The sweat had turned south not merely to kill, but to teach, teaching through fear, patience, and the suffocating certainty of its presence. By autumn, the southern coast was cloaked in silence. The air hung heavy with salt and decay, carrying the faint smell of burned herbs from every village, every manor. The fever had arrived, inexorable, leaving the people of Kent and Sussex to wonder if any part of England could ever breathe freely again. And so the sweat, having mastered north and city alike, moved like a shadow across the southern hills, reminding England that death did not march in armies or sound its approach. It came on wind and breath, on every inhalation, and in the end, no distance was great enough to outrun it. It came unexpectedly. After 3 long years of suffocating heat, endless sweat, and the ceaseless wail of the dying, the fever paused. London, York, Cambridge, and the southern counties, places that had been hollowed by the sweat, experienced the first day in which it seemed to rest. The air hung lighter, almost fragile, as though it had been released from a burden too great to bear. People did not yet rejoice, they only noticed, cautiously, that the usual weight pressing against their chests had lifted. In the streets, those still alive emerged from behind sealed doors. Windows, long nailed shut, were cracked open for the first time in months. The river reflected pale sunlight instead of a murky shadow. Children stepped into alleys they had long avoided, their small hands brushing against walls that had seemed to lean inward with heat and decay. Merchants peeked from behind counters, wary that any movement might summon the fever back. The physicians, many of whom had survived by hiding or donning armor, gathered in cautious assemblies. They examined the sick who remained, noting their faintly cooled skin, the slower pulse, the shallow sweat that no longer streamed like rivulets across linen. "It rests," one muttered, unsure whether to trust his own eyes. Perhaps it has learned something from its own cruelty. Others remained skeptical. After so many days and nights of invisible terror, even a lull was suspect. In the palaces, courtiers dared to open windows. Candles, long dimmed, were replaced and lit once more. The Queen's perfume, once an attempt to mask fear, now mingled with the natural air, offering the faintest comfort. Servants, those who had survived by obedience and caution, whispered to one another that the worst had passed, but dared not speak too loudly. Silence had taught them caution. Outside the city walls, farmers looked upon their fields with disbelief. Crops that had been neglected, overgrown with weeds, now seemed capable of harvest. Animals that had fled to barns were wandering again, their hooves stirring the damp soil. Even the Thames appeared calmer, reflecting a sky that seemed to have grown pale, clear, and infinite. London's heartbeat, once muted by fear, began to thrum again, tentative, uneven, but unmistakable. Yet, the relief was fragile. People knew that the fever had rested before, and they also knew it could awaken. They buried the dead quickly, burned the linens, and continued to wear herbs and masks. The city moved cautiously, as though every step might awaken the slumbering plague. Children still slept in the same rooms where their siblings had perished, their parents watching every breath. The sweat had taught a lesson in fear that even a day of calm could not undo. By evening, the streets felt almost normal, though no laughter returned. Windows glimmered with candlelight, and merchants dared to count coins and dustwares. The city exhaled together, as if testing whether the pause was genuine. And in that fragile silence, London remembered what it was like to live tentatively, painfully, and with the knowledge that the fever might rise again before the next dawn. For the first time in years, the people breathed freely, knowing they had survived, yet understanding that the sweat had only chosen to sleep, not to forgive. It was not sudden, nor was it celebrated. England's awakening from the sweat came gradually, like the tide creeping back over a shore long abandoned. The streets of London, once thick with heat, sweat, and fear, began to stir again. Windows that had been nailed shut for years now opened slowly, letting in light that was unfamiliar and almost painful in its brightness. The river Ouse, Thames, and every smaller stream reflected a sun that seemed newly generous, washing the city in gold where before there had been only grey. People emerged cautiously. Children ran across streets they had been told were deathly, their laughter tentative at first, fragile as glass. Mothers watched from doorways, still gripping hands and rags, counting every breath. Fathers exhaled heavily, realizing that each inhale no longer carried dread. Those who had hidden for months, those who had buried family members in haste, now dared to step out of doors that had become tomb-like. London's heartbeat, long suppressed by fear, pulsed again, tentative, unsteady, yet unmistakably alive. The courtiers returned to their chambers, though silence still clung to the palace halls. Candles were lit, the Queen's perfumes spread softly across corridors, and servants moved with cautious confidence. The king appeared once more at his window, surveying a city that had survived, though battered and hollowed. Letters from Cambridge, York, and the southern counties arrived at last, carried by couriers who had endured the fever, delivering news not of death, but of survival. In the universities, the scholars began to walk among their libraries once more. Books, left open to pages smeared with ink and sweat, were dusted carefully, the silence between their voices like a remembrance of the absent. Classes resumed in small groups at first, students wary of each other's breath, of every cough, every sudden movement. Even as they relearned their routines, they remembered the lessons the sweat had taught, that life is fragile, that knowledge cannot protect the body from the air, and that fear itself is a teacher. The merchants, too, emerged cautiously, reopening markets and counting goods with gloved hands. Ships set sail again from the harbors, carrying trade southward and abroad. Gold no longer carried the same weight of terror, but people handled it with care, as though remembering the invisible hand that had once guided it toward death. The aroma of bread, roasted meat, and smoke returned to the streets, mingling with the lingering sense of herbs burned for protection, a fragrant memory of the city's ordeal. And yet, even as life returned to England, it was altered. The houses, once filled with laughter and commerce, bore the memory of absence. Streets echoed with the faint, empty impressions of those who had vanished. Cemeteries overflowed, memorials of families torn apart. Londoners spoke in whispers for a time, cautious of every sound, every breath. They remembered the sweat, and they honored its lessons quietly. The fragility of life, the indiscriminate reach of death, and the merciless patience of a plague that had walked through walls and breath alike. By the first winter after the fever's departure, England could finally exhale. It was a measured breath, full of fear and gratitude, relief tempered by remembrance. The people had survived the unthinkable. The air, once heavy and merciless, felt lighter, freer, though memory clung to it still. In homes, in churches, and along the streets, candles burned, bells tolled once more, and whispers of the dead became part of the city's voice. England had survived, its people had endured, and for the first time in years, the nation breathed together, fragile, cautious, and fully aware that life, though returned, was forever marked by the shadow of the sweat.